The room smelled of old paper and expensive ambition. 50 chairs had been arranged around a single mahogany table inside the private library of a dead man, and every one of those chairs was occupied by someone who had spent decades being told they were the smartest person in the room. Outside, news vans lined the curved driveway of the Whitmore estate, their satellite dishes tilting upward like flowers chasing a signal. Inside, the hum of a particular kind of silence pressed against the walls, the silence of people who are waiting for someone else to say the wrong thing first. And at the center of the table, inside a clear archival sleeve on a velvet pad that one of the junior attorneys had placed there with visible ceremony, sat one handwritten letter that nobody in the room could understand. 3 days they had been at it, and the letter had not moved, and the answer had not come, and the morning light through the tall window fell across the mahogany in long stripes that reminded everyone, if they were paying attention, that time was continuing to pass regardless of their progress. Charles Whitmore had died on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, quietly, in the bedroom of the house where he had lived for 43 years. He was 81 years old. He had no children, no surviving siblings, and no spouse. What he did have was a fortune that spanned 6 continents, a collection of rare mechanical puzzles that occupied an entire wing of his estate, and a reputation so large and so carefully layered that even people who had never met him felt they knew exactly what kind of man he was. He had built his first company at 24, with borrowed money and a second-hand typewriter. By 40, his name was on the cover of 3 national business magazines in the same calendar year. By 60, he had quietly stepped back from the daily operations of his companies and devoted himself to what his associates called his obsession and what he himself called his only real pleasure: the construction and deconstruction of puzzles in every form they could take. Word puzzles, mathematical puzzles, mechanical puzzles, logical puzzles that took the form of conversations, or letters, or architectural choices in the houses he designed and donated to institutions he admired. He was, in the most literal sense available to a man of his particular temperament and means, a person who believed that the distance between a question and its answer was the most interesting territory in the world. He was not a man who enjoyed making things easy. He was a man who believed that the effort of understanding something was inseparable from the value of the thing understood. His employees knew this. His lawyers knew this. The trustees of his estate knew this in a very specific and professionally inconvenient way when, 3 days after his death, they opened the sealed envelope he had left behind and discovered that a portion of his assets, a sum that his attorneys described only as substantial, which in Whitmore's vocabulary meant staggering, had not been allocated to any named beneficiary. Instead, there was a letter, and beneath the letter, a single typed instruction. The distribution of the unallocated estate would follow the interpretation of the enclosed correspondence, and that interpretation must be verified by independent legal counsel before any disbursement could be made. The letter was short, disturbingly short, for a man who was known to have written 200 pages of private philosophical notes in a single calendar year. It was handwritten in Whitmore's distinctive slanted cursive, and it filled less than half a page. When the trustees first read it, they assumed they had missed something. When they read it a second time, they were certain they had. When they read it a third time, they called their senior partners, who read it twice, and called their own senior colleagues, who read it in a group, and argued about it for 40 minutes without reaching any conclusion except the unanimous agreement that they needed people better equipped for this particular problem. Within 48 hours, every major university in the country had received an urgent and carefully worded request to send their most qualified faculty members to the Whitmore estate for what the legal team was calling a scholarly consultation of urgent significance. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Academics, it turned out, respond very quickly to the combination of intellectual mystery and the implicit suggestion that they are among the few people in the world capable of solving it. 53 professors arrived over the course of 2 days. They came from universities whose names carried weight in every corner of the world, linguists who had authored foundational texts on semiotics and the philosophy of language, mathematicians who had published theorems that reshaped the way their colleagues thought about pattern and structure and the nature of hidden information, historians who specialized in coded correspondence from wartime intelligence operations, Men and women who had spent careers translating the desperate ingenuity of people trying to speak across enemy lines. Philosophers whose work on meaning and interpretation had been cited in courtrooms and classrooms with equal frequency. Cryptographers who had spent careers inside government agencies that officially did not exist. People whose names appeared on no public list and who had never, in any professional context, been allowed to describe what they actually knew. They arrived with laptops and printed references and the quiet confidence of people who had never encountered a problem they could not eventually solve. The legal team set them up in Whitmore's private library. A room with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a single tall window that looked out over a garden that had been allowed to grow slightly wild, the way Whitmore had apparently preferred it, and the scholars arranged themselves around the mahogany table with the brisk purposefulness of people who have a great deal to prove and are looking forward to proving it. The letter was photocopied and distributed. The original remained sealed in its archival sleeve at the center of the table. People read. People reread. Some of them made notes on legal pads. Some of them opened laptops and began cross-referencing databases. Some of them held their photocopies up to the light, as if the paper itself might offer something the text had withheld. And then, quite naturally, people began to talk. By the end of the first hour, 4 distinct working groups had formed around 4 competing interpretations. By the end of the first afternoon, those 4 groups had fractured into 8, each with its own theory, its own evidence, and its own quietly contemptuous assessment of the theories being advanced by the others. By the following morning, there were 19 separate theories about what the letter meant, who it was addressed to in the metaphorical sense, and what exactly Whitmore had been trying to conceal within it. And the one thing all 19 theories shared was the complete and unshakable certainty that Whitmore had embedded something beneath the surface of the text, some second layer of meaning that required precisely the kind of trained, analytical intelligence currently crowded around the mahogany table, arguing with the restrained but unmistakably combative register of people whose careers and reputations were inseparable from being right. The cryptography group was convinced the unusual punctuation marks constituted a substitution cipher, each dot and comma, corresponding to a letter in an alphabet that Whitmore had constructed from some reference they had not yet identified but would. The mathematics group pointed to the spacing between certain words as evidence of a numeric encoding that, once deciphered, would yield coordinates or a sequence that would unlock whatever Whitmore had chosen to hide. The linguists argued for a system of embedded meaning at the level of syntax, a grammar of concealment they had seen used in a handful of documented historical cases. The philosophers proposed that the letter was not a puzzle at all but a test, designed to see whether its readers could transcend the assumption that a puzzle must have a hidden solution and recognize that the surface meaning was itself the content. This position was received with polite but visible impatience by the cryptographers, who had not left tenured positions and comfortable offices to be told that the answer was to stop looking for an answer. Nobody noticed the man mopping the hallway outside. Marcus Reed had worked at the Whitmore estate for 23 years. He had come to the job the way a lot of people come to jobs they end up keeping for decades. He needed work. Someone knew someone, and the position was available. He had been 19 years old, recently arrived in the city from a small town, 3 states away, carrying a duffel bag and a very clear sense that his life was going to require sustained effort, though he had not yet worked out in what direction. The estate manager at the time had looked at him for about 4 seconds and told him to start on Monday. He had started on Monday, and he had come back every Monday since, for 23 years, because the job was steady and the work was honest, and because, in the private accounting of his own life, the library was extraordinary. He had never told anyone about the library in a way that captured what it actually meant to him. He mentioned it sometimes, casually. The way you mention something you love to people you suspect will not quite understand why you love it, will hear the words and file them under a general category of pleasantry, rather than registering the particular weight behind them. But in the private hours of his own life, in the small apartment he had rented for 12 of the past 23 years on the 4th floor of a building, 3 blocks from a bus stop, Marcus Reed read. He read the way some people exercise or pray, which is to say consistently and quietly, and with a discipline that came not from obligation, but from a hunger he had never quite been able to name. He had tried, occasionally, to explain it to people. The best he had managed was that reading was the only activity he had found in which the world became fully real, rather than slightly approximate, in which things that had only existed as words became, for the duration of the page, as present and dimensional as the room around him. He read history and literature and philosophy and biography and natural science and political theory. He had read Montaigne and Orwell and Ralph Ellison and Cormac McCarthy and Hannah Arendt and James Baldwin, and a great many writers whose names had come to him through the recommendations of the books themselves, one author mentioning another in an acknowledgments page or an interview, the reading expanding outward from each center the way light moves from a point source. He had read books about mathematical elegance, and books about the history of exploration, and books about the psychology of decision-making, and books about codes and ciphers, and the long strange history of secret correspondence, not because he had any professional reason to, but because he found the subject beautiful in the way that all things are beautiful when they reveal the lengths human beings will go to in order to speak honestly to one another under conditions that make honesty dangerous. He had read widely in Whitmore's own collection over the years, not during working hours, he was careful about that, but on the occasions when he arrived early or stayed late, when the house was quiet and the light was coming through the windows at the angle that meant the day was either just beginning or nearly done, he would sometimes take a book from the shelf and read standing at the shelf, replacing it exactly as he had found it, at the same angle, with the same dust pattern undisturbed. He had thought about whether this required permission, and had concluded that it did not because permission did not matter, but because permission, in this instance, was so self-evidently not a meaningful category that raising the question would have been its own kind of absurdity. Books unread are not diminished by being read. Knowledge ungiven is not diminished by being found. He believed this about libraries the way he believed it about most things that contained what people needed and kept it just out of reach through the application of arbitrary barriers. He had seen Whitmore in the library sometimes, in the earlier years, before age made those visits rare. Whitmore had never acknowledged Marcus's presence in the specific way that meant he was aware of it and had chosen not to object. But Marcus had been aware of it anyway, the way you are aware of a choice someone makes when they make it in your vicinity. It was close enough to an invitation that Marcus had decided to treat it as one. He had, over those years, read most of Whitmore's personal correspondence archive, which occupied 3 shelves in the far corner of the library, bound in chronological order, and indexed by year in the handwriting of a secretary who had worked for Whitmore for 4 decades, and who had, Marcus gathered from the letters, been one of the people Whitmore trusted most completely and mentioned least publicly. He had not approached the archive systematically, or with any particular purpose beyond the one that governed most of his reading, which was interest. He was interested in the mind behind the collection. The letters were the most direct record of that mind, more revealing than the published interviews that journalists had conducted over the decades, and more honest than the authorized biography that had come out in the early 2000s, which Whitmore had reportedly described as accurate about the facts and wrong about everything else. Reading those letters over years and years, Marcus had come to know certain things about Charles Whitmore that existed nowhere in the public record. He knew the rhythm of the man's thinking across the architecture of a page, the way he always circled toward a central point rather than leading with it, saving what mattered most for the moment when the reader had been prepared to receive it. He knew the small, physical habits of the man's handwriting, the slight rightward lean that intensified under emotional pressure, the way the cursive contracted and tightened when the subject of a letter was something Whitmore found genuinely difficult to say. He knew which subjects made the writing expand and which made it contract. He knew what Whitmore's anger looked like on paper and what his grief looked like and what his affection looked like. And he knew these things the way you know the handwriting of someone you have read for a long time, not as data but as presence, as the person made legible on the page. And he knew about the indentation. He knew it the way you know something that has been part of the visual background of your experience for so long that it has ceased to register as a thing you know and has simply become a feature of the world, like the sound a particular door makes or the angle a certain window admits light at a certain time of year. He would not have thought to mention it to anyone. He could not have imagined the circumstances under which anyone would need to know it, except that apparently those circumstances existed and had arrived, and now he was standing in a room full of 50 people who did not know it. He had been aware at the edge of his attention that the professors were in trouble before they were aware of it themselves. He could hear the quality of the conversations changing over 3 days. the way a musical key shifts when something tonal is going wrong. On the first day, it was bright and competitive. On the second day, it was urgent. On the morning of the third day, it was something else, something tighter and more carefully controlled, the sound of people managing the distance between their expectations and their reality. Marcus finished the section of hallway he was working on. He moved his cart to the side of the corridor. He stood in the doorway of the library with his hands loose at his sides, and waited for someone to notice that he needed to collect the waste bin near the window. A woman near the door, Professor Diane Abrams, who held a joint appointment in cognitive science and philosophy at a university in the Northeast, looked up and said, "Excuse me, we're in the middle of something," in a tone that was not unkind, but was firmly intended to keep the conversation from having a middle. Marcus said he understood, and that he just needed to empty the bin by the window if that was all right. Nobody objected. Several people looked at him with the particular quality of non-attention that settles around service workers in spaces where other things are considered important, the look that processes the category without registering the person. He moved to the window. He emptied the bin, and because the archival sleeve containing the original letter was directly in his sightline, and because he had been thinking, for 3 days, about what he was hearing from the hallway, and because something had been bothering him in a way he couldn't quite locate, he looked at it. He did not touch it. He simply looked at it the way you look at something when you are trying to let your eyes do the work your brain has been prevented from doing by the noise of its own certainty. The letter was short enough to read in a single careful sweep. He read it. He read it again. He stood still for a moment, that felt, from the inside, like a held breath, and then a thought arrived in his mind so quietly and completely that it felt less like solving something than like recognizing something he had always known. He said, "Excuse me," and 3 people looked up by reflex. He said it again, a little more clearly. "I think I might be able to see what it says." The room changed temperature. Professor Gerald Hutchins, who had been standing at the far end of the table, with a printout in each hand, looked over the top of his reading glasses at Marcus, with an expression that was professionally courteous and completely dismissive in the manner of someone who has learned to combine those two qualities without apparent effort. "I'm sorry," he said. "The letter," Marcus said. "I think I know what it means." The silence that followed was of a specific and identifiable kind. It was the silence of a room full of people processing an unexpected variable and choosing, very deliberately, how to respond without allowing the choosing to be visible. Then Dr. Paul Renfrew, a younger professor who specialized in historical cryptography, and who had been rather more quietly skeptical of his own theories than most of his colleagues, said, "All right, walk us through it." 2 or 3 people made sounds that lived adjacent to laughter. Professor Hutchins's expression adjusted in a way that communicated a precise and efficient quantity of skepticism. Someone at the far end of the table set down a pen with a small, deliberate click. Marcus looked at the letter through the archival sleeve. He was quiet for what he would later estimate was about 7 minutes, though the people in the room would remember it differently. The way time in moments of uncertainty is always remembered wrong. Then he said that Mr. Whitmore had written a great many letters, and that he had spent years cleaning the room that housed them, and that Whitmore had a habit, not a code but just a habit, of putting the most important thing he wanted to say at the beginning of the final paragraph, not buried in it. Right at the first line, and he always marked where that paragraph began with an indentation slightly deeper than the rest of the text. "You could see it in the original," Marcus said, pointing without touching. The photocopy had cropped it out, or the contrast had flattened it, but in the original it was there, the first line of the last paragraph, sitting a half space further in than every other line in the letter. Whitmore had done it the way some people underline something without drawing the line, and if you read from that line forward, without looking for a code, just reading it as you would read a note from someone you had some reason to know, he was telling you exactly where something was. The room did not become silent immediately. There was a murmur that moved around the table, and then a pulling back of chairs, and then Dr. Renfrew was leaning over the archival sleeve, with a magnifying lens he had retrieved from his jacket pocket, and then he said, very quietly, "The indentation is different." And then the room was entirely silent. Professor Hutchins set down his printouts. He walked to the table with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who is moving towards something he is not sure he wants to confirm. He looked at the letter for a long time. He said, "That's not possible." In a voice that made clear, he understood exactly how possible it was. What Marcus had identified was not a cipher. It was a characteristic of Charles Whitmore's personal correspondence that anyone with sufficient familiarity with the archive would recognize immediately, a stylistic habit so small, and so consistent and so far beneath the partis threshold of what 50 experts had been trained to look for that it had been perfectly invisible to all of them. They had arrived expecting a lock, requiring a key. Whitmore had left a door standing open and trusted that only someone who already knew the house would think to try the handle. When Marcus read aloud the final paragraph beginning from the indented line, the meaning was plain and immediate. Whitmore named a building in the older commercial district of the city. The address of the office he had first rented when he was 24 years old. He named a year, the year his first employee had come to work for him, stated as naturally as a date in any ordinary letter. Together, these constituted a location and a combination. The language was clear and unambiguous. There was no second layer. There was nothing hidden beneath the surface. Only the assumption that something must be. An assumption so well established in that room, on that day, among those people, that it had functioned more effectively than any encryption Whitmore could have devised. Professor Hutchins sat down slowly in a chair and did not speak for several minutes. "Doctor," Renfrew returned the magnifying lens to his jacket pocket and stood with his hands folded, looking at the letter, in the posture of someone absorbing a correction that they know, in the long run, they will be grateful for. The doctoral candidate, who had been sitting at the back taking notes for 2 days, set down her pen and looked at Marcus without any performance in her expression at all, just the open, unguarded look of genuine astonishment. The legal team was notified within the hour. 2 senior attorneys cross-referenced the interpretation against Whitmore's archived personal letters and confirmed the indentation pattern in 27 separate instances across 3 decades of correspondence. The match was exact and documented and beyond any reasonable dispute. A car was arranged, a small group was assembled, and when one of the attorneys asked Marcus if he would come with them, he said yes, but that he needed to finish the section of hallway he had not gotten to yet. Because there was still a section he had not gotten to. He finished it. Then he went. Dr. Renfrew rode in the car beside him on the way to the commercial district. They did not speak for the first part of the journey. Then Renfrew said, quietly, that he had spent 2.5 days in that library and had been certain, at various points, that he was within an hour of the answer. Marcus said he understood how that could happen. Renfrew said that he thought the difficulty was that expertise, at a certain depth, generates a kind of gravity around certain categories of explanation and makes others feel almost physically implausible, and that this was probably useful 95% of the time and catastrophic the other 5. Marcus said that sounded about right. They rode the rest of the way without talking, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that 2 people arrive at when they have both said something honest. The building in the commercial district was brick and frosted glass. 4 stories, sandwiched between a print shop and a dry cleaner that had been on that block since the early 1980s, when the neighborhood had been something different from what it was now. A property management representative was waiting outside with a key and the slightly dazed expression of someone who had been given an unusual amount of context for an ordinary task. They went up a staircase that smelled of floor cleaner and old wood, which registered on Marcus with the specific attentiveness of someone for whom that smell had been a daily fact for 23 years, and walked to a door at the end of the second-floor corridor. The representative unlocked it. Inside was a room that was entirely empty, except for a metal cabinet bolted to the wall in the far corner, painted the dull, institutional gray of things that are meant to last. The cabinet had a combination lock. An attorney read out the year from the letter, the year of Whitmore's first hire, stated in the letter with the natural offhandedness of a personal reference anyone who knew Whitmore would understand, and Marcus turned the dial. 3 numbers, left and right and left. The lock opened on the first attempt, with a small, clean click that seemed, in the silence of the empty room, considerably louder than it was. Inside the cabinet were a leather-bound journal whose cover had darkened with age, a stack of handwritten letters bundled with a rubber band that had gone brittle and cracked slightly when one of the attorneys reached for it, and a single folded sheet of notepaper with 3 short paragraphs written in Whitmore's slanted cursive. They brought everything back to the estate, and the legal team spent the rest of the afternoon with it, and Marcus sat in a chair near the window in the library while they worked. And outside the garden, moved in the late afternoon wind in the way of things that have been allowed to grow without a plan. The journal was Whitmore's record of his early years, before the money and the companies and the reputation that had come to define him in the public imagination. He had worked, in those years, as a warehouse loader and a night janitor and a part-time delivery driver and, for 8 months when he was 22, as a dishwasher in a hotel kitchen, where the head chef had treated the back-of-house staff with a contempt so systematic and so cheerful that it had clearly stopped registering as contempt to him and had become simply the way things were. Whitmore had written about the chef without anger, noting him the way a naturalist notes a specimen. Here was a man for whom the hierarchy of the kitchen had become indistinguishable from a hierarchy of human worth, and he enforced it with the breezy confidence of someone who has never had occasion to question the framework that benefits him. Whitmore had washed dishes for 8 months, and observed this, and filed it away, and moved on to the next thing he needed to do, to get to the place he was going. He had been passed over for positions he was qualified for because he lacked the right credential, the specific piece of paper that certain organizations use as a filter, not because it reliably identifies capable people, but because it efficiently reduces the number of applicants to a manageable size. He had been spoken to, on more than one occasion, by people who equated his circumstances with his intelligence, who saw a young man in work clothes and assumed they understood everything relevant about what was happening inside his head. He had written about this without self-pity and without bitterness, in the tone of a man who is noting facts because he intends to do something about them and does not want to forget the precise shape of the wrong he is eventually going to correct. The journal made clear that Whitmore had not forgotten, that he had carried it with him through 40 years of accumulating the kind of power and credibility that the world had initially withheld from him, and that he had been waiting, with the patience of a man who builds very long puzzles, for the right moment to use what he had accumulated to say what he had always wanted to say. The handwritten letters in the bundle were personal correspondence between Whitmore and a small number of people he had trusted over the decades. A former teacher who had recognized something in him when he was 17, a childhood friend who had stayed in the small town where they both grew up, and whom Whitmore had supported financially and quietly for the last 30 years of both their lives, a woman he had loved for 2 years in his mid-30s, and who had eventually made a life with someone else, and whom he had continued to correspond with, affectionately and without complication, for decades afterward. The letters were private and largely unrelated to his business life. They showed a man who was, in private, considerably warmer and more uncertain than the public figure who had been photographed on magazine covers and interviewed by serious journalists who always emphasized the same qualities: the precision, the strategic intelligence, the deliberate cultivation of difficulty as a mode of thought. The letters showed someone who doubted himself in ordinary human ways, who cared about people in ordinary human ways, who had simply also happened to be extraordinarily good at building things that lasted. The folded notepaper was the document that mattered legally. It established a charitable foundation devoted to educational access for working adults, people who had not had the opportunity to attend university when they were young, or who had circumstances that prevented them from finishing, or who had simply never been given a reason to believe that the path was open to them. The foundation was endowed with a sum large enough to operate indefinitely. It would award grants for tuition and for living costs during study, and for the kinds of expenses that educational institutions rarely mentioned when they talked about access and opportunity, the childcare and the transportation, and the gap in income that a working adult accepts when they choose to spend time studying instead of earning. And in its final clause, it appointed the person who solved the letter whom Whitmore predicted, in a parenthetical that might have been dry humor and might have been the deepest conviction he held, would not be a credentialed academic, as the inaugural director of the Foundation's community outreach program, at a full salary with full benefits, answerable to a board he had already named and constituted years in advance. The attorney reading the clause paused at the end of it. Then she looked up. Every person in the room was already looking at Marcus, who was standing near the doorway because no one had told him to sit, and he had spent 23 years standing near doorways in this house. Dr. Renfrew began clapping. And it was not the uncertain applause of someone following a social cue. It was the applause of a man who understood precisely what had occurred and felt entirely clear about the appropriate response. Others followed, one by one, until the room was full of it. Professor Hutchins was the last to begin. But he did. Marcus stood still during all of this. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at the room. His expression was not triumph. And it was not embarrassment. Though it contained something of both, it was primarily something harder to name the expression of a person who has spent a very long time being invisible to a particular kind of attention and who is standing, for the first time, in the full light of it, and is not yet certain what it requires of him. He was thinking, he would say later, about Charles Whitmore. About the warehouse loader and the night janitor and the dishwasher who had become, eventually, the man whose estate he had cleaned for 23 years. About the specific patience required to carry something unproven for decades and then construct, at the end, a situation precise enough to prove it. About the particular faith that required. He stood there until the clapping stopped. Then he said thank you, in a voice that was too quiet for the room, and someone near the front laughed, not unkindly, and the tension broke into something warm and briefly shapeless before the attorneys returned everyone to the practical business of what happened next, which was considerable. There were reporters outside when they returned to the estate. More the following morning. The driveway that had been quiet for 40 years of Whitmore's residence was briefly, improbably, crowded with people and equipment, and the low continuous sound of professional urgency. More the next morning. Within 2 days, the story had traveled far enough that news organizations from outside the country were calling the estate's legal office. The narrative constructed itself quickly and cleanly. The eccentric billionaire, the stumped professors, the overlooked janitor, the open secret hiding in a letter no expert could read. It was the kind of story that arrives already assembled around its own moral. And the moral was one that many people were ready to hear. Marcus spoke publicly once during those first weeks, at a brief gathering outside the estate that the legal team arranged after the volume of press inquiries made some kind of statement unavoidable. He was uncomfortable in the way people are when they have spent their lives doing things and are now required to perform the doing of things, and he made no effort to conceal this discomfort because he did not think concealing it would serve anyone. He wore a jacket he had owned for several years, that he had brought out for funerals and job interviews, and the occasional formal occasion that his life had produced, and which fit him well enough that he did not think about it. He stood at a small podium that someone had assembled in a hurry, and looked at the reporters who were assembled in the driveway and said, before they could ask anything, that he wanted to be precise about what had happened, because the imprecise version was already circulating, and he thought precision mattered. He was not, he said, smarter than the professors in that library. He had not solved a problem they could not solve. He had noticed something they had not noticed, which was a different thing, and the difference was not intelligence. The difference was familiarity. He had spent 23 years in the proximity of one man's habits of mind, and those habits included a specific and consistent pattern in personal correspondence that anyone with sufficient access to the archive would have recognized. The professors had not had that access. They had arrived with extraordinary preparation for an extraordinary problem, and the problem had turned out not to be extraordinary. Whitmore had not hidden anything. He had simply written a letter, in the way he always wrote letters, and left it where people would look for something more complicated than what was there. One reporter asked why he thought Whitmore had set it up this way, with the professors and the elaborate presentation of the challenge, if the answer was as simple as Marcus was describing. Marcus thought about this for a moment. He said that he thought Whitmore had wanted to make a point, and that making a point required a demonstration, and that a demonstration of this particular point required precisely the audience that had been assembled. If the letter had been given to any random person on the street, the point would not have been made. The point required the contrast. It required the 50 professors, and the 3 days of failure, and then the janitor who had read the man's letters for 20 years. Without all of that, it was just a letter. With all of that, it was an argument. And Whitmore, whatever else he was, had always preferred his arguments to be airtight. A second reporter asked what he would say to people who found the outcome inspirational. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing words with some care. Then he said that the word inspirational always made him a little cautious, because it tended to suggest that a situation was exceptional, when sometimes it was simply the ordinary correction of an ordinary mistake. A great many people, he said, had been read wrong their entire lives. And it did not usually end with a press conference and a foundation. He wanted to be honest about that. The money and the attention and the legal outcome were not the point of what had happened. The point, if there was one, was that Charles Whitmore had understood, in the specific and embodied way that people understand things they have personally survived, that the person most likely to read his letter correctly was not the person with the most formal preparation. And he had spent the final act of his public life and a considerable portion of his fortune constructing a proof of that understanding, which was, Marcus said, allowing himself the first small smile he had permitted in front of a camera since all of this had begun, exactly the kind of thing you would do if you were a man who had spent your whole life building puzzles and had, at the end, one final puzzle worth the trouble of constructing. The foundation was chartered 6 weeks after Whitmore's death. Marcus began his work in an office that had been set up in a building downtown, 3 rooms and a reception area, modest by the standards of the estate but larger than anything he had worked in on his own. The board was composed of 5 people whom Whitmore had selected years in advance and who were, without exception, competent and direct, and more interested in producing results than in discussing the production of results, which Marcus found immediately and profoundly reassuring. In the first year, the foundation awarded grants to 412 people across 12 states. In the second year, the number doubled. In the third year, it doubled again, and the board convened to discuss whether the pace of growth was sustainable, and Marcus presented a plan for sustaining it that he had been working on for 6 months, and the board approved it with minor amendments, and then they went back to work. Marcus built the outreach program around a principle he did not state aloud very often because it sounded obvious, and obvious things, in his experience, rarely survive being stated. The point was not to find exceptional people. Exceptional people, in the main, eventually found their own way. They had the self-belief, or the determination, or the one teacher who noticed them at the right moment. And those resources, while not sufficient for everyone, were sufficient for most of the people who had them. The point was to find the ordinary, extraordinary ones, the people whose intelligence had simply never been introduced to the room where intelligence was recognized and put to use. The people who had spent years being the smartest person in a context too small to require what they were capable of, working jobs that used a fraction of what they contained, because the credential that would have opened the right door had been unavailable to them at the moment it mattered, for reasons ranging from money to circumstance to the simple failure of anyone to tell them that the door was there. He was good at finding these people. He was good at it, he thought. Partly because he was one of them. And people who have spent years being invisible to a certain kind of attention develop, as a natural adaptation, a very precise ability to see what that attention misses. He did not romanticize this. Being overlooked is not a gift. It is a cost, and the people who bear it deserve better than to be told that what was taken from them has secretly made them stronger. But the capacity it sometimes generated, the habit of patient observation, the ability to hold a problem at a distance and wait for the obvious thing to become visible that was real, and Marcus used it, and the people who worked with him over time came to recognize it as the quality that made him, in the specific work the foundation was trying to do, unusually effective. Professor Hutchins wrote him a letter approximately 4 months after the events at the estate. It was handwritten on university stationery, which Marcus noticed, and it was 2 pages long, which was 2 pages longer than strictly required to convey its central point, but exactly the right length to convey the respect behind that point. Hutchins wrote that he had spent considerable time thinking about what had occurred, and that he had arrived at the conclusion that the experience had been useful to him in a way that discomfort is sometimes useful when it arrives alongside something true. He said that he had been, for most of his professional life, in the habit of assuming that the depth of a person's knowledge was most accurately read through the formal signals by which knowledge declares itself, and that this assumption was not without validity but was, he now understood, incomplete in ways that had cost him something real. He wrote that he hoped Marcus was well, and that the work he was doing mattered, and that he was grateful, which was an unusual word for an academic to use in formal correspondence, and which Marcus read 3 times. He kept the letter in a drawer in his office, not as a reminder of vindication. He was not much interested in vindication, which had always struck him as a backward-looking emotion, useful for about 20 minutes before it curdled into something less productive. He kept it because it was evidence of something more useful than vindication, that a person could be badly wrong about something that mattered, and then choose to do the honest thing about being wrong, and that this choice, made in the absence of any external requirement, was worth acknowledging as the rare and genuinely admirable thing it was. Dr. Renfrew sent a copy of a paper he published in a journal of cryptography and cognitive science. A case study analyzing the Whitmore letter as an instance of what Renfrew termed expertise-induced perceptual filtering, the way deep domain knowledge generates background assumptions that can render certain categories of obvious information invisible. The paper was careful and extensively hedged in all the ways that academic papers are required to be careful and hedged, and in its final paragraph, Renfrew offered the observation that Whitmore appeared to have anticipated this dynamic with some precision and to have constructed the puzzle accordingly, which suggested either an unusual depth of self-knowledge regarding the psychology of expertise or a remarkable cynicism about institutions, or possibly both. Marcus read it twice. He thought it was very good. He also thought that the plainest version of the thing the paper was circling was one that could not easily be stated in an academic paper because it was too simple and too uncomfortable at the same time, which was that Whitmore had not trusted the professors to solve the puzzle because he did not believe that intelligence was a function of institutional recognition, and he had spent real money and the last deliberate act of his public life constructing a proof of that belief. But that was the kind of thing you understood while mopping a hallway, not the kind of thing you published in a journal. And Marcus thought Renfrew's version was probably more useful in the specific context anyway. Several months after the foundation was established, and the initial wave of attention had settled into something quieter and more sustainable, Marcus returned to the Whitmore estate to collect a rain jacket and a pair of work boots, and a small stack of books he had left in a storage closet, things he had accumulated there over 2 decades, and had not thought to gather in the compressed and unusual days following Whitmore's death. The new estate manager, a woman named Patricia, who was efficient and kind and seemed to operate on the principle that those 2 qualities were more compatible than most management literature suggested, offered him coffee, which he accepted. He walked the hallways where he had spent portions of 23 years of his life, past the room where the professors had argued, past the tall window looking out over the garden that was still wild in the way that Whitmore had always wanted it. The staff he encountered greeted him now, and he greeted them all in return. And he asked about the woman whose daughter had been applying to colleges and was told she had gotten in, which was good, and he asked about the man who managed the grounds and was told the knee surgery had gone well and he was back, which was also good. And he made a mental note to look into whether the Foundation's grant criteria might, in future cycles, be designed to reach people in exactly the circumstances of the people he was speaking to. Because that was the kind of thought that arrived naturally when you paid attention, and he had been paying attention in this building for a very long time. He collected his things. He said goodbye to Patricia. He walked out through the main entrance and down the curved driveway where, some months earlier, news vans had parked with their satellite dishes tilting upward. The driveway was quiet. The autumn light moved through the trees that lined it in the particular way that light moves through trees in the late afternoon, finding angles through the gaps and falling in long pieces across the gravel. He stood for a moment before getting in his car, not dramatically, not with any performed sense of significance, simply the way a person stands for a moment at the edge of a place that has been the context of a large portion of their life, taking one more look because they can. Then he got in, and he drove back to the office, and he went back to work. He had learned, over 23 years of doing jobs that needed doing, that work was not something you returned to. It was something you continued. The greatest mistake people make is assuming wisdom wears a title.